Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand battlefield or a bustling marketplace, but to a quiet, almost forgotten corner of ancient history. You're snuggled down, maybe with a weighted blanket, and as the soft light from your screen flickers, you're about to discover a color. Not just any color, mind you, but the color. The one that made emperors swoon, senators strut, and everyone else green with envy. Imagine a world where most fabrics were muted, earthy tones, browns, dull greens, natural beiges. Then, suddenly, a flash of something so profoundly vibrant, so impossibly rich, that it seemed to hum with an almost otherworldly energy. That's the world we're entering, a world obsessed with a shade so potent, so deeply symbolic, that it practically defined an empire. You'll be so relaxed, you probably won't survive this journey without drifting off, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes for a moment, and when you open them, you're not in your cozy room anymore. You're standing on the sun-baked shores of the ancient Mediterranean, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt and something distinctly fishy. Around you, the world is a kaleidoscope of natural, mostly subdued hues. The sandy ground beneath your bare feet is ochre, the distant hills a hazy blue-gray, the tunic of the fisherman walking past you is undyed linen, a pale cream. Then you see it. A merchant ship, it sails a stark white against the azure sky, pulls into the small harbor, and on its deck, draped over the railings, are bolts of fabric. Not just any fabric, but a deep, resonant purple. It's not a simple violet, nor a bright magenta. This is a color that holds secrets, a hue so profound it seems to absorb the light, only to release it back with an almost internal glow. This is Tyrian Purple, and even from a distance, you can feel its magnetic pull. For millennia, human beings have been drawn to color. We paint our caves, adorn our bodies, dye our clothes. But imagine a time when achieving a truly vibrant, lasting color was not just difficult, but nigh impossible. Most natural dyes, derived from plants or insects, were fleeting. They faded with every wash, dulled with every exposure to sunlight, leaving behind a ghost of their former glory. Your best toga might look stunning on laundry day, but by the time you wore it to the forum, it was already starting its sad journey to pastel oblivion. Then there was this purple. It defied the rules. It didn't fade. In fact, some accounts suggest it actually deepened and became more lustrous with time and exposure. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a permanent marker in a world of chalk. And it was quite simply stunning. You can almost hear the collective gasp of awe from the ancients. My goodness, look at that. It's like a bruise on a grape, but in the best possible way. This isn't just about aesthetics, though. This is about power. From the earliest civilizations, certain colors became associated with status. Gold because it was rare and shiny. White because it symbolized purity or divinity. But purple? Purple held a unique place. The Phoenicians, those ancient master mariners and traders whose cities like Tyre and Sidon dotted the coast, were the first to truly harness the secret of this dye. They built vast empires not just on trade routes, but on the back of this single, extraordinary color. You might think of them as the world's first luxury brand, their logo being, well, purple. The allure wasn't just its permanence or its beauty. It was its almost insurmountable rarity. To produce even a small amount of this dye required an incredible amount of effort, resources, and, let's be honest, a very strong stomach. We'll delve into the specifics of how they made it later, but for now, just picture this. The raw material came from tiny sea snails, specifically species of murex. To get enough dye for just one toga, you'd need tens of thousands of these unfortunate mollusks. That's right, tens of thousands of little snails giving their lives for your fashion statement. It makes you think twice about complaining about fast fashion, doesn't it? At least your jeans didn't require the sacrifice of an entire snail kingdom. This sheer logistical nightmare meant that the dye was astronomically expensive. We're talking about a commodity so valuable that its price could rival, or even exceed, that of gold, piece for piece. Imagine walking into a modern-day boutique and seeing a scarf priced at, say, $1 million just because of the unique color. That's the kind of price tag we're talking about for Tyrian Purple. So, who could afford such a luxury? Not your average Joe, that's for sure. This wasn't something you just picked up at the ancient equivalent of Target. This was strictly for the elite. In Rome, long before Byzantium took up the mantle, the use of purple was tightly regulated. Senators, for instance, were allowed a narrow stripe of purple on their togas, a subtle nod to their elevated status. Consuls and generals, especially during triumphs, might wear entire purple robes, making them stand out in a crowd like a neon sign in a dimly lit cave. The emperor, of course, got the full purple treatment, practically bathing in the stuff. It was a visual language, a shorthand for, "I'm in charge. Don't even think about arguing with me." You could tell someone's rank just by the width of their purple stripe, like an ancient version of a corporate ID badge, but way more fabulous. Historians still argue whether the exact shade of purple varied significantly between different social ranks or just the quantity of its application. But either way, it was unmistakably the color of power. This profound significance wasn't just about showing off your wealth, though that was certainly part of it. It was about legitimacy. In a world where divine right was often claimed by rulers, associating oneself with a color that seemed almost supernatural, that resisted decay and shone with an otherworldly glow, was a powerful statement. It wasn't just that the emperor wore purple. It was that purple was the emperor. It became synonymous with imperial authority, a tangible manifestation of their connection to the gods. You didn't just respect the purple, you revered it. It was like wearing a halo, but way more practical for everyday empire running. Think of it this way. In a world without mass media, without instant communication, how do you convey power and authority to millions of people spread across vast distances? You do it visually, and few things were as visually impactful as a ruler or their representatives, arrayed in a color that literally no one else could afford or replicate. It was a walking, talking billboard for imperial might. A quirky tidbit about this ancient obsession. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, that the Roman Emperor Nero, known for his extravagance, was so obsessed with purple that he reportedly executed a man for wearing a purple tunic, simply because he deemed it too close to his own imperial prerogative. Talk about a fashion faux pas with fatal consequences. It's a stark reminder that, in the ancient world, looking too good could literally get you killed. This color wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a political statement, a religious statement, and a declaration of ultimate, undeniable authority. It signaled that you were part of an exclusive club, a club so exclusive that its membership was practically determined by your birthright or your conquests. The allure of Tyrian purple, therefore, wasn't just its vibrant hue, but the entire complex web of power, wealth, and divine sanction that it represented. It was the ultimate flex, a silent scream of supremacy in a world that valued visual cues above all else. And as we'll see, the Byzantines, heirs to this Roman legacy, would take this obsession to a whole new imperial level. Imagine, if you will, the gentle lapping of waves against a rocky Mediterranean coastline. The sun, a warm, golden eye in the sky, beats down, glinting off the water. You trudge along the shore, perhaps looking for interesting shells, or maybe just enjoying the salty air. And then you spot them. Not the elegant, spiraling conch shells you might find on a pristine postcard, nor the delicate, fan-shaped scallops. Oh no, these are the unsung heroes of our story, the rather unassuming, often spiky, and frankly, a bit homely sea snails known as murex. Specifically, we're talking about the Hexaplex trunculus, formerly Murex trunculus, and the Balinus brandaris, formerly Murex brandaris, among a few others. These humble mollusks, clinging to rocks or burrowing in the seabed, held within their unassuming bodies the secret to the most coveted color in the ancient world, Tyrian purple. It's a journey that beggars belief. Really, how does a small, slimy, bottom-dwelling creature go from being a potential snack for a curious fish to providing the very hue that would cloak emperors, signify divine right, and become synonymous with imperial power for over 1,000 years? It's not like you can just pick up a purple snail, you know? They don't come pre-dyed. This isn't some ancient, slow-moving version of a paint-your-own pottery studio. The transformation from living mollusk to imperial regalia is a testament to human ingenuity, perseverance, and, let's be honest, a certain tolerance for some truly potent aromas. The story, as best we can piece it together, likely begins not with an intentional scientific expedition, but with a happy accident, or perhaps a series of them. Picture an ancient beachcomber, perhaps a hungry dog, or even a curious child, squashing one of these murex shells against a rock. Curious, yellowish liquid might have oozed out. Maybe it got on their clothes or a piece of fabric they were carrying. Then the sun, that ever-present alchemist, went to work. As the liquid dried and was exposed to sunlight, a miraculous change began to occur. That pale, uninteresting secretion began to shift, turned green, then blue, then, finally, a deep, rich, almost unbelievable shade of purple. The kind of purple that makes you gasp. The kind of purple that whispers power. The kind of purple that makes you think, okay, who's going to clean up this mess? And also, can I make more? Indeed, the very name Tyrian Purple harks back to the ancient city of Tyre, in what is now modern-day Lebanon. The Phoenicians, those intrepid seafarers and master traders, practically cornered the market on this vibrant hue. They were the original purple people, if you will, establishing vast dye works along the Mediterranean coast. This mainstream historical fact is crucial. The Phoenicians didn't just discover the dye, they industrialized its production, turning a quirky natural phenomenon into an economic powerhouse. Their ships, laden not just with timber and glass, but with bolts of purple cloth and small, precious vials of the concentrated dye, sailed across the known world, spreading the fame of this extraordinary color. But how did they get that tiny, precious drop of dye from so many snails? Well, it wasn't a gentle process. Imagine vast piles of these spiky mollusks, collected from the shallow waters or dredged from deeper beds using specialized traps. The first step was to crack open the shells. Not delicately, mind you, but with purpose. Some accounts suggest they'd simply crush the smaller snails whole. For the larger ones, they'd carefully extract the hypobranchial gland, a small, yellowish organ nestled within the snail's body. This gland, no bigger than a grain of rice in some species, contained the magical precursor to the dye. Once extracted, these glands, or the crushed snails themselves, were placed into large vats, often made of stone or ceramic. Then came the truly aromatic part of the process. Water was added, and the mixture was allowed to ferment. For days, sometimes weeks, this concoction would sit, slowly transforming. The air around these dye works would have been thick, not with the scent of lavender or fresh sea breeze, but with something far more earthy. Imagine a seafood market after a particularly long weekend, left unattended. Then add the distinct notes of decay and a touch of something vaguely sulfuric. It was, by all accounts, an olfactory assault. You wouldn't want to invite your in-laws over for a backyard barbecue near one of these operations. It was a smell that clung to everything, a badge of honor for the dyers, and a clear sign to anyone downwind that something very expensive was being created. This fermentation process was crucial. It broke down the complex organic compounds within the gland, preparing them for the final stage. Once the mixture reached the right consistency and pungency, a scientific term, I assure you, it was time for the grand reveal. The vat was heated, and then the prepared wool or linen was carefully dipped into the murky liquid. And here's where the magic truly happened, often under the watchful eye of the sun. The fabric would emerge looking rather uninspired, perhaps a yellowish green. But as it was exposed to light and air, the chemical reaction, driven by a compound called dibromo-indigo, would begin. The color would deepen, shifting through shades of green, then blue, finally settling into that magnificent, deep, indelible purple. It was a true spectacle, a slow-motion reveal of nature's artistry. Now, for a quirky tidbit, to dye just one small toga border, or a single stripe on a tunic, you'd need tens of thousands of these unsuspecting mollusks. To produce enough dye for a full imperial cloak? We're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of snails. Think about that for a moment. All those tiny lives, sacrificed for a single garment. It makes you appreciate the sheer scale of the operation, the vast networks of collectors, the endless patience of the dyers, and the monumental value placed on this color. It's a bit like trying to fill an Olympic swimming pool with eyedroppers, except each eyedropper is a snail, and the pool is a really, really expensive cloak. From its Phoenician origins, the allure of this vibrant purple spread like wildfire. The Greeks admired it, and the Romans, ever keen to adopt and amplify symbols of power, absolutely adored it. It wasn't long before purple became inextricably linked with the highest echelons of Roman society. Senators wore a narrow stripe of purple on their togas, while consuls and emperors donned broader bands, or even entire garments of the imperial hue. Historians still debate the precise origins of the earliest purple dye production and its adoption by various cultures, wondering if it truly began with the Phoenicians or if earlier civilizations had their own fleeting encounters with the elusive color before it became a widespread industry. But what is undeniable is its firm establishment as a symbol of authority by the Roman Republic. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a visual declaration. In a world without mass media, where literacy was limited, color was a powerful communicator. You saw purple, you knew who was in charge. You saw purple, you understood authority. It was the original power suit, but instead of tailored blazers, it involved a lot of crushed mollusks and a very distinct aroma. So, from the humble, slightly malodorous beginnings in a sea snail's gland, through the laborious, smelly, and sun-drenched vats of Phoenician dye works, this extraordinary color embarked on its grand journey. It traveled across seas, adorned the shoulders of conquerors, and solidified its place not merely as a beautiful shade, but as a potent symbol of status, wealth, and power. By the time the Roman Empire transitioned into the Byzantine Empire, this purple wasn't just a tradition. It was an inheritance, a divine mandate, woven into the very fabric of their imperial identity. It was the color of emperors, born from the depths of the sea. You've already had a whisper of the ancient world's most coveted color, a hue so profound it transcended mere aesthetics. Now, let's drift a little further down the river of time, past the shimmering horizons of antiquity, to watch as a grand obsession doesn't just endure but intensifies, like a perfectly aged wine growing richer with every passing year. You find yourself standing at the crossroads of empires, where the mighty Roman eagle, though battered, still casts a long shadow, and a new, equally magnificent phoenix is about to rise from its ashes. Byzantium. You see, the Romans, bless their conquering hearts, were already head over heels for purple. Imagine the bustling forum, the grand processions, the triumphant generals returning from far-flung campaigns. They're not just wearing any old cloak, are they? Oh no, they're draped in the toga picta, a magnificent garment, often entirely dyed in that deep, resonant Tyrian purple. It wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a thunderous declaration. Senators, too, wore purple stripes on their toga praetexta, a subtle but unmistakable signal of their elevated status. It was the ultimate status symbol, the ancient world's equivalent of a supercar that also whispered, "I'm important, and you're not." Even before the Byzantines, the Romans understood that if you wanted to convey power, wealth, and a certain divine favor, you did it in purple. They didn't just like purple, they understood purple. But then, as you observe, things began to shift. The sprawling Roman Empire, in its sheer vastness, started to creak under its own weight. The West, with its iconic city of Rome, eventually faltered and fell. Yet, in the East, a new heart began to beat, strong and resolute. You watch as Emperor Constantine, a man of vision and pragmatism, makes a monumental decision. He doesn't just build a new city, he builds a new Rome. He establishes Constantinople, a city strategically positioned at the crossroads of continents, a bastion of wealth and culture, poised to inherit the grandeur of the old. And with this inheritance came not just the laws, the administrative structures, and the architectural styles, but also, crucially, the Roman Empire's deep-seated, almost spiritual infatuation with the color purple. Now, here's where it gets truly fascinating. Byzantium didn't merely adopt Rome's purple passion, it intensified it. Think of it like a beloved family recipe passed down through generations. The first generation makes it well, but the next generation, with a few tweaks and a dash more love, elevates it to an art form. That's what Byzantium did with purple. While Rome had its purple-striped senators and triumphant generals, Byzantium took the exclusivity to an entirely new level. You see the imperial court of Constantinople, shimmering with an almost otherworldly glow. The emperor, the empress, their immediate family. They are practically bathed in this precious hue. It's no longer just a mark of high status. It becomes the very visual embodiment of divine right. Imagine yourself in the imperial palace. The air itself feels heavy with history and power. You see the emperor emerge, perhaps for a grand ceremony, or simply to receive foreign dignitaries. He is not just dressed, he is cloaked. His robes, woven from the finest silk, are dyed in a purple so deep, so rich, it seems to absorb the very light around it. It's not just a color, it's a living, breathing testament to his God-given authority. For the Byzantines, the emperor wasn't just a ruler. He was God's viceroy on earth, and his purple garments were a constant, irrefutable sign of this sacred connection. This wasn't merely about looking good. It was about being the divine. The Byzantines understood symbolism in a way that perhaps even the Romans, with all their practical might, hadn't fully grasped. Purple became synonymous with the imperial family itself. You'll hear whispers of children born in the purple, a concept that will become incredibly significant later on. For now, just understand that if you were born in a particular room of the palace, one adorned with purple porphyry stone, it solidified your claim to the throne like nothing else. This wasn't a color you could simply buy, even if you were obscenely wealthy. Trying to sneak a bit of imperial purple into your outfit in Constantinople would be like trying to pay for your groceries with monopoly money at a high-end boutique. You'd be instantly clocked, probably by an eagle-eyed palace guard who'd seen more purple than a lifetime supply of grape juice. This intensification wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, strategic move. The Byzantine Empire, often facing threats from all sides, needed powerful symbols to unify its diverse peoples and project an image of unshakable authority and continuity with the glorious Roman past, even as it forged its own distinct identity. And what better symbol than a color so rare, so difficult to produce, and so visually striking that it instantly communicated power, wealth, and divine favor all at once. While the Romans certainly valued purple for its status, the Byzantines imbued it with a profound spiritual and political significance that took it beyond mere luxury. Historians still debate whether the Byzantine emphasis on purple was a natural evolution of Roman tradition or a deliberate, strategic reinvention to solidify the new empire's unique identity, a subtle but significant shift. You might wonder about the sheer audacity of it all. Imagine a society where one color, above all others, was so sacred, so utterly forbidden to the masses, that merely possessing it without imperial sanction could lead to severe punishment. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was an act of treason. This wasn't like a modern luxury brand where you might save up for a designer bag. This was a color that literally defined the ruling class, a visual barrier between the divine and the mundane. The Byzantines weren't just fond of it, they were obsessed. Like that one friend who has to have everything in their signature color, only this signature color cost more than a small country and was guarded by imperial decree. So, as you recline and let your imagination drift through the grand halls of Constantinople, you can almost feel the weight of that imperial purple. It's not just a pigment. It's a narrative, a legacy, a living link to an ancient past, intensified and made even more potent by the Byzantine desire to project an image of unparalleled, divinely ordained power. This was no mere fashion statement. It was the very fabric of their empire, woven with threads of history, ambition, and an unyielding belief in their own unique place in the world. Imagine, if you will, not a gleaming modern laboratory with sterile beakers and precise instruments, but rather a different kind of workshop. One shrouded in thick, almost palpable secrecy, and yes, a truly unforgettable aroma. You're stepping into the heart of the Byzantine Empire's most guarded industrial secret, the creation of true Tyrian purple. This wasn't some quaint cottage industry. It was a state-controlled, meticulously managed, and frankly smelly operation that produced the very essence of imperial power. You trudge along the waterfront, perhaps in the bustling city of Constantinople itself, or maybe in the ancient Phoenician city of Tyre, a historic hub for this very trade. The air hits you first, a pungent, almost gag-inducing wave that makes your nose wrinkle instinctively. It's a smell unlike anything you've ever encountered, a potent cocktail of decaying seafood, stale garlic, and something vaguely sulfuric, like rotten eggs left in the sun for a week. This, my friend, is the unmistakable perfume of power. If you thought a teenage boy's bedroom was bad, just wait until you get a whiff of a Tyrian purple dye works. You might even wonder if the Byzantines used this smell as a security measure, scaring off potential spies with the sheer olfactory assault. The source of this magnificent, yet malodorous, hue, not some exotic mineral or rare plant, but humble sea snails. Specifically, certain species of marine mollusks, primarily murex snails like Hexaplex trunculus, Balinus brandaris, and Stremonida hemistoma. These aren't your average garden snails, mind you, but rather predatory snails found in the Mediterranean Sea. And when we say humble, we mean in their appearance, certainly not in their contribution to the imperial wardrobe. The sheer volume required was staggering. To produce just a single gram of pure dye or enough, perhaps, to tint a handkerchief, you might need to harvest upwards of 10,000 snails. Yes, you heard that right, 10,000 tiny mollusks for a speck of color. This astronomical requirement for raw materials is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the incredible rarity and cost of the dye. Imagine the fleets of boats, the divers, the coastal communities dedicated solely to this relentless snail hunt. It makes you appreciate modern synthetic dyes, doesn't it? Just imagine trying to explain that particular job description on a resume today. Professional snail wrangler and gland extractor. Once harvested, these snails weren't simply thrown into a pot. Oh no, the process was far more nuanced and, dare we say, rather gruesome. The snails were first crushed, or in some cases, their hypobranchial glands, the tiny organs responsible for producing the precursor to the dye, were meticulously extracted. You can picture the scene. Workers, their hands stained and smelling perpetually of brine and putrefaction, cracking open shells, one after another, day in and day out. It was a labor-intensive, slow, and undeniably messy business. This isn't exactly a job for those with a delicate constitution, is it? The crushed snails, or their extracted glands, were then placed into enormous lead or ceramic vats. And here's where the magic, or perhaps the microbial fermentation, really began. The vats were filled with a brine solution, a mixture of salt water, and often, quite surprisingly, human urine. Yes, urine. The ammonia within the urine helped to create the alkaline environment necessary for the chemical reactions to occur. This concoction was then left to ferment, or as the ancient texts more accurately describe it, to putrefy. For days, sometimes weeks, the mixture would sit, bubbling and stewing under the Mediterranean sun, slowly transforming. This putrefaction process was absolutely critical. It broke down the snail tissue and released the colorless precursor compounds that would eventually become the vibrant purple. You can almost hear the gentle, gurgling sounds from the vats, interspersed with the occasional sigh of a worker who'd had enough of the smell for one day. After the initial putrefaction, the mixture was gently heated, but never boiled. The temperature control was crucial. Too hot, and the delicate dye molecules would be destroyed. Too cold, and the reaction wouldn't proceed efficiently. This simmering process would continue for several days, with constant stirring to ensure even distribution and reaction. It was a delicate dance between heat, time, and the mysterious chemical alchemy unfolding within the vats. The liquid, initially a murky, greenish yellow, would gradually begin to change. Here's where a fascinating, almost quirky, tidbit comes in. The precursor compound, known as indoxyl sulfate, is actually colorless. It only transforms into the vibrant purple dye when exposed to oxygen and, crucially, light. So, As the liquid was carefully drawn from the vats and applied to the wool or silk fabric, the magic truly happened. As the fabric, saturated with the seemingly colorless liquid, was lifted into the air and exposed to the sun, you would witness a breathtaking transformation. The fabric would first turn a pale yellow, then a greenish hue, then blue, and finally, deepening into that magnificent, rich, almost glowing imperial purple. It was like watching a slow-motion magic trick, a chemical ballet performed by light and air. Historians still argue whether the Hexaplex trunculus snail specifically produced a blue dye, like indigo, or a purple one, and how much the precise processing and exposure to light influenced the final shade. It's a testament to the complexity of the ancient chemistry involved. The dyeing process itself involved repeated dipping and exposure to air and light, building up layers of color until the desired depth and richness were achieved. This wasn't a quick dip. It was a painstaking, multi-stage process that demanded immense skill and patience. Imagine the dyers, their hands and forearms permanently stained with the regal hue, carefully monitoring each piece of fabric, ensuring uniformity and perfection. One wrong move, one overexposure, and a fortune in dye and fabric could be ruined. It reminds you of a master chef, meticulously crafting a dish, knowing that every ingredient and every step matters. The entire operation was shrouded in absolute secrecy. The Byzantine state maintained a strict monopoly on the production of true imperial purple. The dye works were often located within the imperial palace grounds or in heavily guarded, designated areas. The techniques, the precise recipes, the specific species of snails used, the exact timing and temperatures for fermentation and heating, all of this was considered a closely guarded state secret. Revealing these methods to outsiders or attempting to produce the dye independently could literally cost you your head. This wasn't just about protecting a trade secret. It was about protecting the very symbol of imperial legitimacy and divine right. You couldn't just Google how to make Tyrian purple back then. You'd probably end up in a dungeon. This intense control ensured that only the emperor and those he favored could ever truly wear the color, solidifying its status as the ultimate marker of power. So, while you might think of the Byzantines as being obsessed with gold and mosaics, remember that beneath all that shimmer lay a deep, smelly, and fiercely protected secret. The complex, multi-stage, and utterly fascinating process of creating their beloved Tyrian purple. It was a testament to their ingenuity, their control, and their willingness to endure a truly awful smell for the sake of unparalleled prestige. You've just peered behind the curtain, haven't you? You've sniffed the air, imagined the putrid vats, and perhaps even felt a phantom stickiness on your fingers from the glandular goo. You now understand on a visceral level that creating this imperial hue wasn't just a job. It was an olfactory assault, a dedicated act of chemical wizardry, and frankly, a bit of a nightmare for anyone with a sensitive nose. But here's where the story truly starts to sting your wallet, because all that effort, all that stench, all that meticulous, slow-motion alchemy culminated in something so extraordinarily rare, so mind-bogglingly expensive, that it made a modern-day diamond-encrusted smartphone look like a bargain bin toy. Imagine, if you will, the sheer, unadulterated volume of raw material required. We're not talking about a handful of snails here, plucked from a tide pool on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Oh no, sweet dreamers. You're picturing entire coastlines, scoured clean, their rocky shores swarming with diligent harvesters, day in and day out, for months on end. Think of it, countless tiny, unassuming sea snails, specifically the Murex brand, because only the best will do for an emperor, naturally being gathered by the literal ton. It's like trying to fill an Olympic swimming pool with individual grains of sand. Only each grain of sand fights back a little, smells dreadful, and hides its precious treasure in a tiny, hard-to-reach sack. For context, let's talk numbers, because numbers, darling, are where the true horror of the cost begins to emerge. To produce just a single gram of true Tyrian purple dye, that's less than the weight of a paperclip. Mind you, you needed somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 individual Murex snails. Let that sink in. 10,000. For a speck. Now stretch your imagination a little further. To dye a single, modest toga, not even a full imperial cloak, you might need several hundred grams of dye. Do the math, or rather, don't. It's too depressing before bedtime. But if you insist, We're talking about millions upon millions of these little mollusks, sacrificing their lives, their tiny, slimy existence, just so someone could parade around in a particularly fetching shade of purple. It makes you wonder if there were ancient snail rights activists, doesn't it? Probably not. They were too busy holding their noses. This wasn't just about the sheer number of snails, though that was certainly a major hurdle. It was also about the incredibly low yield of the dye itself. You weren't simply crushing the snails and slathering the resulting goo onto fabric. No, no, no. You were carefully extracting a minuscule gland, processing it, letting it ferment in those delightful vats, and then painstakingly coaxing the color out through a series of chemical reactions that would make a modern chemist raise an eyebrow and say, "Well, that's rustic." The vast majority of the snail was, shall we say, discarded, which, again, adds to the incredible inefficiency and thus the astronomical cost. It's like buying a whole cow just for a single eyelash. Extravagant, to say the least. So, what did this extraordinary rarity translate to in terms of cold, hard cash, or rather, shimmering Byzantine gold solidi? Well, historians still argue whether the price of Tyrian purple dye ever truly surpassed its weight in gold. But what's undeniable is that it came incredibly, terrifyingly close, and often did for finished garments. To purchase a pound of pure Tyrian purple dye, and a pound is still not that much, mind you, you could easily be looking at a sum equivalent to the annual wages of several hundred common laborers. Think about that for a moment. Imagine working your entire life, saving every single coin, and still not being able to afford enough dye to color your handkerchief. Puts things into perspective, doesn't it? This wasn't just expensive. It was the kind of expense that made emperors pause, or at least their treasurers faint. Consider the famous example from the Roman era, which Byzantium inherited and amplified. A single purple-dyed toga could cost as much as a comfortable house in the city, or a sprawling country estate with vineyards and olive groves. It wasn't merely a fashion statement. It was a declaration of wealth so profound it bordered on the obscene. If you saw someone swathed in true Tyrian purple, you didn't just think, "Nice outfit." You thought, that person probably owns half the city, or at least has a very generous benefactor who does. It was the ultimate flex before flex was even a word. It was the ancient equivalent of parking a solid gold Bugatti in front of your mansion, then setting it on fire just to show you could. Please don't do that, by the way. It's bad for the environment and your budget. The cost wasn't solely tied to the snails and their meager yield, either. You had to factor in the immense labor involved. Not just the snail gatherers, but the skilled artisans who knew the secret processes, the dyers who understood the precise alchemy of the vats, the countless hours of simmering, stirring, and waiting. This wasn't a job you could just pick up after watching a quick YouTube tutorial. This was a generational skill, passed down with meticulous care, often under conditions of intense secrecy. These weren't minimum wage jobs. These were highly specialized, highly valued positions, and their expertise added significantly to the final price tag. Imagine trying to get a master chef to cook you dinner using only ingredients he had to personally harvest from the bottom of the ocean, one tiny morsel at a time, and then process by hand in a smelly shed. The bill would be eye-watering. And then there was the demand. Who wanted this stuff? Oh, just about everyone who was anyone. Kings, queens, emperors, empresses, high-ranking senators, and the wealthiest of the wealthy. Everyone who aspired to power, status, or simply wanted to rub it in their rivals' faces. This wasn't a dye for the masses, or even the moderately affluent. This was a color reserved for the absolute pinnacle of society. Its scarcity wasn't just natural. It was also artificially maintained by the Byzantine state, which recognized its immense value as a tool of power and prestige. They didn't want everyone running around in purple because then it wouldn't be special, would it? It would be like everyone suddenly owning a unicorn. The magic would be gone. There's a quirky little tidbit that perfectly illustrates this obsession with cost and status. Even the smell of Tyrian purple was considered a mark of authenticity and luxury. The dye, as you know, had a rather distinct, pungent aroma, even after it was applied to fabric. It was the lingering ghost of those delightful fermentation vats. And rather than being a drawback, this smell became a subtle, sensory indicator of genuine imperial purple. If your purple garment didn't have that faint, musky, slightly fishy whiff, well, then you probably weren't wearing the real deal. It was like the ancient world's scratch and sniff sticker of wealth. Oh, is that a new cloak, dear? Let me just sniff. Ah, yes, genuine Imperial purple. I can tell by the subtle aroma of 1,000 deceased mollusks. Truly the height of sophistication. So, when you consider the millions of snails, the painstaking, time-consuming extraction process, the highly skilled labor, and the insatiable demand from the most powerful individuals in the known world, you begin to grasp why this extraordinary dye commanded fortunes. It wasn't just a color. It was a liquid form of concentrated power, a visible declaration of untouchable wealth, woven into the very fabric of empire. It was a luxury beyond compare, a whispered secret of opulence, and a testament to the fact that sometimes the most magnificent things come from the most humble and often the most odorous beginnings. You could buy a fleet of ships, a thriving business, or a lifetime of comfort for the price of a single imperial robe. And that, my sleepy friends, is why the Byzantines loved their purple dye so much, not just for its beauty, but for the sheer jaw-dropping cost that ensured only they, the truly elite, could ever wear it. All right, settle in a little deeper, you sleepy historian. You've just learned about the eye-watering cost and sheer rarity of Tyrian purple, a color so exclusive it practically had its own VIP velvet rope. But here's the kicker, the real mic drop moment in the story of this majestic hue. The Byzantine state didn't just appreciate purple. It owned purple. Every single precious drop of it. Imagine if the government today owned the rights to, say, the color blue, and only the president could wear jeans and only on Tuesdays. That's the kind of vibe we're talking about, only infinitely more serious and, frankly, a lot smellier. You see, for the Byzantines, purple wasn't just a color pigment. It was a strategic national resource, a liquid gold that symbolized the very core of imperial power. And like any good authoritarian regime worth its salt, or rather, its crushed snails, they weren't about to let just anyone get their sticky little fingers on it. No, this was a state monopoly, a carefully constructed economic and political fortress built around a single, vibrant shade. Picture yourself now, a curious citizen of Constantinople. You might hear whispers, feel a certain tension in the air, whenever the topic of purple came up, because the production, distribution, and even the very use of imperial purple were locked down tighter than a drum, or perhaps tighter than a jar of fermenting murex guts. The imperial workshops, known as the purpurea or porphyra, were not some quaint little artisan studios you could wander into on a Sunday afternoon, hoping to pick up a discounted scarf. Oh no, these were high-security facilities, typically nestled within the secure confines of the Great Palace itself, or in heavily guarded compounds elsewhere in the capital. You wouldn't just stumble upon one. You'd probably need a blood oath, a secret handshake, and a family tree that proved you hadn't even thought about looking at unauthorized purple. Think of it like a medieval Fort Knox, but instead of gold bars, they were hoarding giant vats of bubbling, noxious, purple-producing goo. The stench alone, you can imagine, would have been a natural deterrent for casual sightseers. Oh, what's that delightful aroma? You might ask, wrinkling your nose. Just the smell of absolute power, darling. A guard might deadpan, adjusting his helmet, and he wouldn't be wrong. The control started right at the source, the murex snails themselves. These weren't just any snails. They were specific species, primarily Hexaplex trunculus and Belinus brandaris, found in particular coastal areas of the Mediterranean. The Byzantine state exercised strict control over these fishing grounds. Harvesting the snails wasn't a free-for-all. It was a state-sanctioned operation. Imagine coastal patrols, perhaps even a dedicated imperial fleet, ensuring that no rogue snail gatherers were out there trying to make a quick buck by illicitly scooping up the little dye factories. You couldn't just rock up to the beach with a bucket and spade and start collecting murex for your DIY purple project. That would be like trying to print your own money, only with more slime and a much worse smell. There's even a quirky tidbit that suggests specific families or communities were granted hereditary rights, or perhaps hereditary obligations, to harvest these snails for the state, ensuring both secrecy and a consistent supply. It was a generational commitment to stinky mollusks. Once harvested, the snails, or rather their hypobranchial glands, were transported to the imperial workshops under heavy guard. And it's here, within those secured walls, that the true magic and the true secrecy happened. The precise methods of extracting, fermenting, and processing the dye were closely guarded imperial secrets. This wasn't something written down in public manuals or taught in open universities. It was knowledge passed down through generations of specialized, trusted artisans, often eunuchs, who were bound by oaths of secrecy and subject to the strictest surveillance. You can almost hear the hushed whispers, the clinking of chains, as new apprentices were brought in, their lives now inextricably linked to the pungent, purple-stained world within. Historians still debate the precise effectiveness of this intense secrecy, whether the recipe was ever truly lost or simply became uneconomical to produce on a large scale after the fall of Constantinople. But what is undeniable is the intent, to keep the process absolutely, unequivocally within imperial hands. The finished product of the rich, concentrated dye was then used exclusively for imperial garments, banners, and other items sanctioned by the emperor himself. This wasn't a commodity that could be bought or sold in the open market, not even for a king's ransom, though it was worth more than most kings could ever dream of. The very idea of an unauthorized person possessing, let alone wearing Tyrian purple, was an affront to the state, a direct challenge to the emperor's authority. The penalties for such an transgression were severe, ranging from hefty fines that would bankrupt generations to mutilation or even death. Imagine trying to explain to a Byzantine official why your new toga has a suspiciously imperial hue. Oh, it's just grape juice. Yes, definitely grape juice. Spilled it myself. Good luck with that. This meticulous control wasn't just about showing off. It was about maintaining the very fabric of Byzantine society and reinforcing the emperor's divine right to rule. If anyone could wear purple, what would distinguish the emperor? What would make him seem chosen by God? The state's monopoly on purple was a cornerstone of imperial propaganda, a visual manifestation of their absolute power. It projected an image of unmatched wealth, unparalleled authority, and a direct connection to the divine. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Byzantine state's control over Tyrian purple was a deliberate and central pillar of its imperial policy, designed to reinforce the unique status of the emperor and his court. Consider the bureaucracy involved. You'd have imperial treasurers overseeing the expenditures, logistics experts managing the snail supply chain, and legions of guards and spies ensuring no dye-filled vats went missing. It was a complex operation, meticulously documented, at least what records survived, and fiercely protected. Every thread of imperial purple fabric, every ceremonial boot, every mosaic tile shimmered with the weight of this state control. It wasn't just a color. It was a constant, shimmering reminder that the emperor was the supreme authority, and that his power extended even to the very pigments that adorned his person. So, as you drift off, think about the vast, complex machinery of the Byzantine state, all focused on one thing: keeping that glorious, stinky, incredibly expensive purple dye exclusively in imperial hands. It was a color guarded by law, by military might, and by the sheer, overwhelming smell of its creation. Sweet dreams of snails and sovereignty, little historian. Now, as you settle deeper into the velvet folds of your imaginary imperial couch, let's peel back another layer of Byzantium's purple obsession. We've talked about its rarity, its cost, its guarded production. But what did all that exclusivity mean? What did it communicate when you, a humble Byzantine citizen, caught a glimpse of the emperor? Well, it wasn't just about looking fancy, was it? Oh no, my friend. This was about power, status, and a direct, shimmering line to the divine. Imagine yourself standing in the Hippodrome, a vast, roaring amphitheater filled with tens of thousands of your fellow Byzantines. The air is thick with anticipation, the scent of dust and sweat, and the distant murmur of the crowd, like a giant, restless beehive. Suddenly, a hush falls, then a wave of murmurs, then a collective gasp. Through a grand archway, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun, emerges the emperor. He doesn't just walk, he glides. And what catches your eye, what sears itself into your memory, is the color. A deep, rich, almost impossibly vibrant purple. It's on his boots, his tunic, his cloak, perhaps even on the trappings of his horse. It's not just a color. It's a statement, a declaration, a thunderclap of visual authority that reverberates through the very stones of the city. For the Byzantines, the emperor wasn't just a political leader or a military commander. He was God's chosen representative on earth. He was the isopostolos, or equal to the apostles, a living icon of divine authority, a direct conduit between the heavenly realm and the earthly one. And how do you visually signify such an extraordinary, almost incomprehensible status? You drape him in the most precious, the most difficult to obtain, the most visually striking color known to humanity. You make him purple. This wasn't some casual fashion choice, like deciding whether to wear stripes or polka dots to a court function. This was deliberate. This was theological. This was an unyielding assertion of divine right. When you saw the emperor in his purple regalia, you weren't just seeing a man. You were seeing the embodiment of God's will, made manifest in a hue that whispered of sunsets, deep oceans, and unimaginable wealth. It was like seeing a superhero in their signature costume. But instead of fighting villains, this superhero was managing an empire and claiming direct divine endorsement. And honestly, it probably worked better than a cape. The very act of wearing this particular shade of purple was a privilege reserved only for the emperor and, on rare, highly sanctioned occasions, for members of his immediate imperial family. It was a state monopoly, yes, but more than that, it was a divine monopoly. To even attempt to wear it, to mimic it, to dye your own tunic in that forbidden shade, was not just an act of defiance against the state. It was an act of sacrilege against God himself. Imagine the audacity. It would be like trying to wear the Pope's special hat to church, but with far more severe consequences than a disapproving glance from the usher. You'd be looking at a one-way trip to a very uncomfortable dungeon, or perhaps a permanent separation from your head. This exclusivity amplified the color's power. Because you never saw it on anyone else, its appearance on the emperor was always astonishing, always awe-inspiring. It created an immediate visual hierarchy. Everyone else, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful senator, wore colors that, by comparison, seemed dull, muted, and utterly mundane. You might have your blues, your greens, your reds, your browns, lovely, perfectly respectable colors for mere mortals. But they were not the color. They were not purple. And in that simple, stark contrast lay the entire Byzantine understanding of imperial power. Think about the psychology of it. From birth, a Byzantine citizen would be taught that the emperor was special, set apart, chosen by God. And then, when they saw him, this abstract concept would solidify into a tangible, shimmering reality. The purple wasn't just fabric. It was a visual sermon, a constant reminder of the emperor's unique status. It was a nonverbal command, a silent declaration that said, "I am here, I rule, and my authority comes from above." Probably made his voice sound more authoritative too, even if he was just asking for a cup of tea. "Fetch me the tea, but make sure it's imperial tea, peasant." This connection between the emperor and purple was so deeply ingrained that it permeated language itself. You might hear phrases like "clothed in purple" or "donning the purple" to refer to the act of becoming emperor. It was a shorthand, a symbol so potent it stood in for the entire office. It wasn't just a uniform. It was the very essence of emperorship. It was the brand identity, meticulously crafted over centuries, and it was devastatingly effective. One of the most mainstream historical facts about Byzantine emperorship is that the emperor was not merely a secular ruler but also held significant religious authority, often acting as the head of the church in many respects, a concept sometimes referred to as Caesaropapism. Though historians still debate the precise extent and theological implications of this blend of secular and spiritual power, this dual role made the purple even more significant, bridging the earthly and the divine in a single, magnificent hue. It wasn't just about showing off wealth. It was about demonstrating piety and divine favor. Now for a quirky tidbit. The Byzantines weren't just particular about who wore purple, but sometimes even what shade of purple. There were nuances. The true imperial purple, the color of the emperor's boots and robes, was said to be a unique, almost reddish purple, derived from specific murex snails. Other, lesser purples, perhaps made from different species or cheaper dyes, might have been used by high-ranking officials or even certain foreign dignitaries as gifts, but they were never the imperial purple. It was like differentiating between a genuine designer handbag and a very good, but ultimately fake, knockoff. One wonders if the emperor had a personal color consultant, meticulously ensuring the shade was always perfect, never too blue, never too red, always impeccably imperial. The purple permeated every aspect of imperial display. When the emperor rode in triumph through the streets, his horse would be draped in purple silks. When he sat on his throne, it would be upholstered in purple. His signature, the crucible, would be stamped with purple ink. Even the imperial seals, the very symbols of his decrees, incorporated the color. It was a constant visual reinforcement, a kind of subliminal messaging campaign that screamed, "This is power, this is divine, this is purple." And it wasn't just for grand ceremonies. Even in the quieter moments, the emperor was perpetually surrounded by this potent color. His private chambers, his dining hall, the very air he breathed seemed to take on a purple tint from the sheer volume of fabric and decoration. It was a constant reminder, not just to his subjects, but perhaps even to himself, of the immense burden and sacred nature of his office. He couldn't just kick back in a comfy pair of sweatpants after a long day of empire-ing. He was always on duty as the living symbol of God's rule. One imagines him perhaps sighing, "Oh, for a simple pair of beige slippers." But alas, duty called, and duty was purple. So, when you consider why the Byzantines loved their purple dye so much, it wasn't just an aesthetic preference like choosing your favorite flavor of ice cream. It was foundational. It was theological. It was the bedrock of their imperial identity. It was the visual shorthand for an entire civilization's understanding of power, faith, and the divine right to rule. It was more than a color. It was a creed, woven into the very fabric of their empire. All right, cozy up a little closer, because we're about to step out of the emperor's glittering palace and into the hushed, incense-filled realm of the Byzantine Church. If you thought purple was just for the earthly rulers, prepare for a divine revelation. In Byzantium, the sacred wasn't just adjacent to the imperial. It was deeply, inextricably intertwined, and purple was the shimmering thread that wove them together. You see, the Byzantines weren't content with merely having their emperors bathed in this magnificent hue. They believed God himself, or at least his earthly representatives, deserved nothing less. Imagine, if you will, standing in the vast, echoing space of the Hagia Sophia. The light, filtered through ancient windows, catches the mosaics above, turning gold to fire. But down below, moving through the reverent throngs, comes a figure whose presence commands not just respect, but awe. It's the Patriarch of Constantinople, the spiritual head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and he is often draped in a garment of such profound, rich purple that it seems to absorb all other colors around it. This wasn't just any purple, mind you, but the purple, the very same Tyrian shade that adorned the emperor himself. His sakkos, a heavy, embroidered tunic, might be a deep, almost blackish violet, or a vibrant, luminous amethyst, depending on the light and the specific dye batch. It's like watching a living, breathing stained glass window walk among you, only far more imposing. This wasn't some casual fashion choice. A what-to-wear to Sunday service dilemma solved by raiding the imperial closet. Oh no, the purple worn by the patriarchs and high-ranking bishops was steeped in layers of theological meaning. It symbolized Christ's kingship, his divine authority, and his ultimate sacrifice. Think about it. The King of Kings, draped in the color of earthly royalty, yet transcending it. It was also, quite powerfully, a visual echo of the emperor's own purple, a deliberate mirroring that underscored the concept of symphonia, the harmonious relationship between the spiritual and temporal powers. The Church, in essence, was reflecting the divine order through its own use of imperial symbolism. It's like when your little sibling tries to dress exactly like you. Only in this case, the little sibling was a spiritual powerhouse claiming an equally divine mandate. You'd see purple not just on the patriarch, but on other significant vestments. The epitrachelion, a stole worn around the neck by priests and bishops, might feature intricate purple embroidery, perhaps depicting saints or biblical scenes. The omophorion, a wide band worn over the shoulders by bishops, could also be purple, signifying the bishop as the good shepherd carrying his flock. These weren't just clothes. They were sacred objects, often blessed and imbued with spiritual significance, and the purple dye itself, with its mysterious origins and incredible value, only amplified that feeling of sanctity. It was a physical manifestation of the divine presence, a tangible link to something beyond the mundane. Imagine trying to get that dry cleaned. Sorry, sir. We don't do divine authority in this establishment. Beyond the everyday, well, as everyday as Byzantine liturgical life could be, purple truly shone during grand ceremonies. Picture a major feast day, like Easter, the holiest of all. The entire atmosphere would be electric. The air thick with incense, the chanting resonating off the high domes, and then the procession. Clergy, deacons, chanters, all moving with solemn grace, and amidst them, bursts of deep, regal purple, perhaps on banners unfurled, catching the breeze as they moved from the church doors to the forum, or on the covers of sacred books, like the Gospel, carried aloft, its pages filled with golden script on purple parchment, a truly breathtaking sight that would make even the most jaded TikTok influencer pause. This was visual storytelling at its most potent, a spiritual drama unfolding before your very eyes, with purple playing a starring role. Consider the emperor's coronation, a ceremony that blurred the lines between church and state so thoroughly you couldn't tell where one began and the other ended. The patriarch himself would place the crown upon the emperor's head, both figures likely arrayed in their finest purple, symbolizing not just the emperor's earthly power, but his divine election. It was a massive public declaration, a spiritual endorsement of the imperial family. And speaking of the imperial family, you might recall our earlier chat about the porphyrogenitos, those born in the purple chamber. Well, that concept wasn't just about the palace. It had deep resonance with the church too. The purple birth chamber was a sacred space, a kind of holy of holies where the next emperor, chosen by God, literally came into being. This spiritualization of imperial birth only solidified purple's divine connection. But the symbolism of purple in the church extended beyond mere vestments and grand pageantry. It permeated the very fabric of Byzantine theology and art. In iconography, for instance, you often see Christ depicted wearing purple and gold, especially in his role as the Pantocrator, the almighty ruler. The purple signifies his imperial majesty, his sovereignty over creation, while the gold speaks of his divine light and glory. Sometimes, even the Virgin Mary would be depicted with purple accents, particularly on her inner garments, subtly linking her to royalty and the divine lineage of Christ. It was a visual shorthand, instantly recognizable, communicating profound theological truths without a single spoken word. It's like a super exclusive club where the dress code is the message. Historians still argue whether the church's adoption of purple was primarily an emulation of imperial power, a savvy political move to share in the emperor's prestige, or an independent theological development of color symbolism, rooted in earlier Christian traditions that saw purple as a color of royalty and suffering. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a convenient convergence of political ambition and spiritual interpretation, beautifully expressed through the most expensive dye known to man. But regardless of the chicken or egg debate, the outcome was clear. Purple became an undeniable symbol of the sacred in Byzantium. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. It's theorized that the faint, distinctive smell of the murex dye, which was notoriously pungent during its creation, might have actually clung to the expensive purple vestments even after they were finished. Imagine the patriarch celebrating liturgy, and a faint, briny, almost sweet scent wafting from his robes. It would have been a subtle, subconscious reminder of the dye's origins, its incredible value, and perhaps even its otherworldliness, connecting the wearer to the very earth and sea from which this sacred color emerged. It's like having a designer perfume that smells faintly of ancient mollusks. A truly unique selling proposition, you might say. Eau de Murex, by His Holiness. The church's use of purple wasn't just about showing off, either. It was about creating an immersive, multisensory experience that elevated the worshipper, transporting them from the mundane world to the divine. When you saw the patriarch in his purple sackos, surrounded by gold and mosaic, the heavy scent of incense in the air, the rhythmic chanting echoing, you weren't just observing. You were participating in a moment of transcendence. The purple wasn't merely a color. It was a conduit, a visual prayer, speaking of majesty, sacrifice, and the eternal reign of God. It reminded everyone that the Byzantines didn't just love their purple. They believed it brought them closer to the divine. And who are we to argue with that? Imagine, if you will, that you are a foreign dignitary, perhaps a chieftain from the wild steppes, or an ambassador from a nascent kingdom in the west, or even a rival empire's envoy. Your journey to Constantinople has been long, arduous, and frankly a bit dusty. You've heard whispers of the city's legendary wealth, its impenetrable walls, and the almost mythical power of its emperor. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the moment you finally step into the great palace. The air itself seems to hum with an ancient, weighty power. You trudge through echoing halls, past mosaics that glitter with 1,000 tiny eyes, each one seeming to judge your every step. The scent of exotic incense mingles with something else, something rich, deep, and subtly animalistic. A smell you can't quite place, but it seems to cling to everything. And then you are ushered into the throne room. And that's when it hits you. Not the emperor's stern gaze, not the glint of gold, but the color. It's everywhere. The emperor himself, seated on a throne that seems to reach for the heavens, is draped in it. Robes of such an impossibly deep, lustrous purple that they seem to absorb the very light around them, radiating an aura of untouchable majesty. This isn't just a color. It's a statement, a declaration, a silent roar. You might think, well, that's a bit much, isn't it? But for the Byzantines, it was just right. It was the ultimate flex, long before anyone ever invented the term. Now, you're not just here to gawk, though it's hard not to. You're here to negotiate, to plead, perhaps even to threaten. And the Byzantines, masters of soft power long before anyone coined that term either, understood the profound psychological impact of their imperial purple. They didn't just wear it, they weaponized it, not with swords or spears, but with threads and dyes. As part of their intricate diplomatic dance, the Byzantines frequently employed purple-dyed garments and other precious items as gifts. These weren't mere trinkets. They were carefully calculated tokens, each thread imbued with the power and prestige of the empire itself. Think of it like this. If you're trying to impress a foreign dignitary today, you might offer them a state dinner, a fancy watch, or maybe a limited edition sports car. For the Byzantines, a bolt of their true imperial purple fabric, or a robe woven from it, was the equivalent of handing over the keys to a custom-built, solid gold Bugatti that also happened to grant you a minor title. It was a gift that screamed, in a voice louder than any orator, "We are rich, we are powerful, and we deem you worthy of a piece of our unparalleled magnificence." Receiving purple from the emperor was never just about getting a nice new outfit. It was a highly symbolic act. It signaled favor, a recognition of status, or an invitation into the imperial sphere of influence. For a lesser chieftain, it might mean the emperor acknowledged their rule, perhaps even saw them as a client king. For a powerful rival, it could be a subtle nod towards a potential alliance, a way of saying, "Look what we have, imagine what we could achieve together." Or, conversely, it could be a gentle reminder of who was truly at the top of the pecking order. "Here, have some of our fabulous purple. Remember who gave it to you." It was a gift that came with invisible strings, often tying the recipient, however loosely, to Constantinople's grand web of power. Historians still debate whether the recipients of these gifts truly grasped the full, almost sacred significance of the dye, or if they simply viewed it as an incredibly expensive, oddly scented fabric. But regardless of their full comprehension, the sheer visual impact and the known rarity of the material spoke volumes. Imagine being a rough-and-tumble barbarian leader, accustomed to simple wool and furs, and suddenly being presented with a shimmering, deep purple cloak that felt like spun moonlight. It would be utterly alien, yet undeniably impressive. It would make your own robes feel like glorified potato sacks. And that, dear listener, was precisely the point. One mainstream historical fact that beautifully illustrates this practice is the Byzantine Empire's extensive use of purple gifts in their diplomatic relations with the Rus people, particularly during the 10th century. When Princess Olga of Kiev visited Constantinople, she was showered with gifts, and certainly, purple textiles would have been among them, solidifying the cultural and religious ties that would eventually lead to the Christianization of Rus. These weren't just friendly gestures. They were strategic investments in future alliances and the spread of Byzantine influence. The purple was a silent, persuasive missionary. The types of purple items given varied. Most famously, there were robes and cloaks, often intricately embroidered with gold thread. But you might also find purple-dyed silk hangings, which could transform a drab tent or hall into something resembling a piece of the imperial palace. Occasionally, even diplomatic documents, treaties, or imperial letters were written on purple parchment, often in gold or silver ink, making the message itself a piece of art and a statement of power. Imagine getting a letter like that. You wouldn't just read it. You'd probably frame it, put it under lock and key, and show it to everyone who ever visited your humble abode. Look what the emperor sent me. Now for a quirky tidbit. While the Byzantines prized their true Tyrian purple for its color fastness and vibrancy, the production process, as we've discussed, was notoriously malodorous. There are accounts, albeit few and far between, of foreign envoys or commoners who encountered the dye works complaining about the pervasive, fishy stench. So, while you're admiring your magnificent new purple cloak, you might also be subtly wrinkling your nose, thinking, wow, this is beautiful, and smells faintly of a very expensive, very ancient fish market. A small price to pay for imperial favor, perhaps, but a humorous detail nonetheless. These gifts were a form of psychological warfare, a display of wealth and technological superiority. No other kingdom could produce this color with such intensity and permanence. It was a secret, guarded by the state, and its very existence underscored Byzantium's unique position in the world. When a foreign ruler received a purple gift, they weren't just getting a piece of fabric. They were getting a piece of the empire's mystique, a tangible link to the divine authority of the emperor, and an undeniable reminder of Byzantine wealth and sophistication. It was a subtle way of saying, we don't just rule. We also have the best fashion sense on the planet, and you can't even make this stuff. The act of giving purple also served to elevate the recipient in their own eyes and in the eyes of their people. To wear a Byzantine purple garment was to literally clothe oneself in a piece of the empire's prestige. It could bolster a leader's authority, legitimize their rule, and even protect them from rivals, simply by association with the mighty emperor in Constantinople. It was like getting a celebrity endorsement, but from the most powerful celebrity in the known world. In essence, purple was a universal language of power, understood even by those who didn't speak Greek. It transcended linguistic barriers and cultural differences, conveying messages of alliance, dominance, friendship, or even veiled threats, all wrapped up in an exquisite, impossibly vibrant hue. It was a silent conversation, a visual dialogue that cemented relationships, averted conflicts, and projected the unparalleled majesty of the Byzantine Empire across continents. The Byzantines didn't just love their purple dye for themselves. They loved it because it was an indispensable tool in their diplomatic arsenal, a potent symbol that commanded respect, envy, and ultimately influence without ever needing to draw a sword. It was the ultimate soft power flex, woven into the very fabric of their imperial ambitions. You drift now not through the bustling markets or the grand hippodrome, but into a space far more exclusive, far more hushed. Imagine, if you will, the deepest, most secure heart of the great palace of Constantinople. You're not just entering a room. You're stepping into a legend, a place steeped in so much imperial power that the very air seems to hum with it. This is no ordinary chamber. This is the fabled porphyra, the purple chamber. As you float through the unseen walls, you notice the light here is different. It's not the bright, unfiltered glare of the Mediterranean sun. Instead, it's a soft, almost ethereal glow, diffused through panels of porphyry marble, that deep, reddish-purple stone, so rare and so precious, that it was reserved almost exclusively for imperial use. The walls themselves are likely lined with it, or perhaps draped in the finest, heaviest Tyrian purple silk, shimmering with an almost liquid quality. You might even detect the faint, lingering scent of expensive frankincense and myrrh, perhaps a hint of rosewater, masking any lingering, shall we say, eau de murex from the dye workshops. It's a room designed not just for comfort, but for profound statement. Think of it as the ultimate VIP lounge, except instead of bottle service, you're delivering an emperor. Now, why, you might wonder, would such a specific, lavish room be so critically important? Well, in the Byzantine Empire, where the transfer of power could often be, shall we say, messy, involving everything from blinding to banishment, and occasionally the strategic application of a pillow, establishing an indisputable claim to the throne was paramount. And nothing, absolutely nothing, screamed legitimacy quite like being born in this particular room. You see, the Byzantines understood the power of symbolism. While Roman emperors before them had often adopted heirs or relied on acclamation by the army, the Byzantines, with their deep-seated belief in divine right, sought a more direct, almost mystical connection to the imperial lineage. This is where the term porphyrogenitos comes in, and it's a mouthful, isn't it? It literally means born in the purple. Not just wearing purple, mind you, but emerging from the very womb within the purple-clad sanctity of this chamber. It's like saying, my birth certificate isn't just notarized. It's practically glowing with divine approval. You can almost hear the imperial midwives whispering, "It's a boy, and he's got that undeniable purple glow." This wasn't just a fancy nursery. It was a political strategy. For centuries, the Byzantine throne was a precarious seat, often seized by ambitious generals or cunning courtiers. The concept of the porphyrogenitos sought to create a clear line of succession, arguing that only a child born to a reigning emperor or empress, within the hallowed purple chamber, possessed the truest, most undeniable claim to the imperial diadem. It was an attempt to inject stability into an inherently unstable system. It was the Byzantine equivalent of a modern-day paternity test, but with way more silk and less uncomfortable waiting. Imagine the empress, in the throes of labor, surrounded by the deep, rich purple. Every push, every breath was not just about bringing a new life into the world, but about solidifying a dynasty. The very act of birth became a political coronation. This wasn't just about a baby. It was about the future of an empire. And frankly, after 9 months of carrying a future emperor, you'd probably want a room that opulent to recover into. Perhaps with a mini fridge stocked with grapes and some really good, quiet Byzantine Netflix. One of the most famous porphyrogenitoi was the Emperor Constantine VII, who reigned in the 10th century. His very name, Constantine, carried immense weight, linking him to the empire's founder. But it was his porphyrogenitos status that truly cemented his legitimacy. He was born in the purple, and he knew it. He even wrote extensively about the imperial court, detailing its customs and ceremonies, almost as if to say, "See, I was there. I witnessed it all. I am the real deal." His birth was not merely an event but a divine endorsement, a seal of approval from the heavens themselves. Now, historians still argue whether the porphyrogenitos designation truly prevented usurpations or merely added another layer to the Byzantine political chess game. After all, despite this powerful tradition, coups and rebellions continued to plague the empire. But it undeniably provided a powerful ideological weapon for those who were born in the purple, giving them a moral and divine high ground over any pretenders. It was an argument that resonated deeply with a pious populace who believed their emperor was God's chosen representative on earth. A usurper might seize the throne by force, but they could never claim the legitimacy of a true porphyrogenitos. It was the ultimate, "I told you so," without having to say a single word, just pointing to your imperial birth certificate written in purple ink. This tradition also meant that empresses were under immense pressure to bear children, especially sons, and to do so within the sacred confines of the porphyra. It added another layer of expectation and scrutiny to their lives. If you were an empress and you were pregnant, you weren't just thinking about morning sickness. You were thinking about the fate of an empire and the perfect purple birthing suite. Talk about high stakes. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. While the porphyra was primarily for birth, it also served as a symbolic reception hall for foreign dignitaries on occasion, particularly those of very high status. Imagine a diplomat, after a long, dusty journey, being ushered into this intensely purple chamber, perhaps to meet a Porphyrogenitos himself. It wasn't just a meeting. It was an immersive experience in imperial power, a visual declaration that screamed, "You are in the presence of greatness, born of greatness, surrounded by greatness." It was the ultimate power move, like hosting your biggest client meeting in a room made entirely of solid gold, but with more history and less chance of a clumsy intern scratching the walls. So, as you slowly recede from the hushed opulence of the purple chamber, you carry with you the understanding that, for the Byzantines, purple was more than just a color. It was the very fabric of legitimacy, the undeniable mark of destiny, and the most potent symbol of imperial birthright. It was the color of emperors, from the moment they drew their very first breath. Now, let's peel back the layers of time and truly see how the Byzantines expressed their profound love for purple, not just in their clothing or their birth chambers, but splashed across the very fabric of their artistic world. You've heard about its cost, its rarity, its imperial grip, but here's where it transforms from a concept into a visual feast, permeating everything from the grandest church domes to the most delicate illuminated manuscripts. You can almost feel the weight of that imperial cloak. Can't you? Imagine the hush as your eyes trace the intricate patterns, the shimmer of gold against that deep, resonant hue. Picture yourself stepping into a Byzantine church, the kind where light filters through alabaster windows, illuminating every surface. Your gaze, almost instinctively, drifts upwards, past the saints and the prophets, to the very pinnacle of the dome, where Christ Pantocrator often presides. And what colors do you see? Gold, certainly reflecting the divine light. But nestled within, or framing the most sacred figures, you'll find that unmistakable, almost velvety purple. It wasn't just a background color. It was a statement. It was the color of heaven, the color of the emperor, and by extension, the color connecting the earthly ruler to the divine. The artistic choices weren't accidental. They were meticulously planned theological statements, each brushstroke a prayer, each mosaic tessera a declaration. This wasn't just pretty art. It was propaganda, devotion, and a visual manifestation of power, all rolled into one gloriously hued package. And frankly, it made everything else look a bit drab, like showing up to a red carpet event in beige. Now, let's talk about manuscripts. Oh, the manuscripts. If you thought an iPad with a million colors was impressive, wait until you see the Byzantine equivalent. These weren't just books. They were treasures, often crafted in imperial scriptoria, the workshops dedicated to producing texts for the emperor and high-ranking officials. Imagine a scribe, meticulously preparing sheets of the finest vellum, often dyed entirely purple. Yes, whole books, not just the illustrations, but the pages themselves, were bathed in that imperial pigment. Writing on purple parchment wasn't just a flex. It was a deeply symbolic act. You weren't just reading words. You were reading words inscribed on the very essence of imperial authority. The text, often in gold or silver ink, would shimmer against this rich background. It's like reading a tweet on a solid gold phone. Unnecessary? Perhaps. Impressive? Absolutely. One of the most famous examples, a mainstream historical fact you simply have to know, is the Rossano Gospels. This 6th century illuminated manuscript, now housed in Italy, contains some of the earliest and most stunning examples of purple-dyed parchment. Its pages are a deep, rich purple, almost black in some lights, with the Greek text written in silver ink, and the sacred names of God and Christ highlighted in gold. It's not just a book, it's a jewel. And imagine the cost. Not just the labor of the scribes, but the sheer expense of the purple dye for every single page. You'd probably need a small fleet of murex snails just for a single volume. It makes you wonder how many poor little sea creatures gave their lives for the sake of divine literature. It's enough to make a modern bookbinder weep, or at least dramatically faint onto a pile of paperbacks. Beyond the full purple pages, the dye also appeared in the intricate illuminations themselves. The robes of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the emperors themselves were frequently depicted in various shades of imperial purple. It wasn't just about making them look good. It was about elevating them, placing them in a realm of divine authority and earthly power that no other color could convey. Historians still argue whether the exact shade of purple used in these depictions always corresponded to the precise Tyrian purple, or if other, slightly less potent, but still highly valued, purple dyes were sometimes employed for broader artistic use. It's a debate for the truly dedicated, the kind of people who can tell the difference between grape and aubergine just by sniffing. Now, let's float into the dazzling world of mosaics. The Byzantine Empire was, without a doubt, the master of the mosaic. These weren't just decorative elements. They were monumental narratives, transforming raw stone and glass into shimmering, eternal stories. And in these vast, glittering canvases, purple played a starring role. Think of the famous mosaics in Ravenna, Italy, particularly those in the Basilica of San Vitale. You've probably seen images of Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora, standing regally, surrounded by their court. What are they wearing? You guessed it, purple. Justinian's chlamys, his imperial cloak, is a deep, majestic purple, adorned with gold embroidery. Theodora, equally resplendent, wears a cloak of a slightly warmer, almost plum purple, intricately patterned. These aren't just portraits. They are declarations of imperial legitimacy, divine favor, and the absolute power of the ruling couple. The choice of purple here is not merely aesthetic. It's foundational to the message. It screams, "We are in charge, and God is totally cool with it." But here's a quirky tidbit you might not know. While the vibrant purple tesserae in mosaics were indeed made to mimic the coveted Tyrian dye, they weren't always dyed glass or stone in the same way fabric was. Often, these purple hues were achieved by incorporating specific minerals like manganese or cobalt into the glass mixture during its creation, or by using naturally occurring purple stones. So, while the color was imperial purple, the method of achieving it in mosaic form sometimes differed subtly from the murex snail process. It's like the difference between a naturally blue blueberry and a blueberry-flavored candy. Both blue, but one required a bit more industrial intervention. This allowed for a consistency and durability that fabric dye couldn't always offer in such a medium, ensuring that the imperial message endured for centuries, even if the snails themselves were long gone. The way the light catches these purple mosaics is almost hypnotic. As you shift your gaze, the tiny glass and stone cubes, called tesserae, reflect and refract the light, making the images seem to shimmer and move. The purple isn't just a flat color. It has depth, a subtle play of light and shadow that makes it feel alive. It accentuates the gold, making it pop, and provides a grounding richness to the often ethereal blues and greens. It's like a master conductor using the deepest bass notes to give resonance to the entire orchestra. Without that imperial purple, the visual symphony of Byzantine art would have lost its most profound and regal chord. From the grandest imperial portraits to the smallest, most intimate prayer books, purple was omnipresent. It wasn't just a color, it was a language. It spoke of power, of sanctity, of an unbroken link to the divine. It was the visual shorthand for an empire that believed itself to be God's chosen earthly representative. And as you drift off, you can almost see the shimmering purple robes of emperors and saints, the glittering pages of ancient gospels, all bathed in that unique, unforgettable hue. It's a color that still whispers tales of Byzantium's enduring mystique, long after the empire itself faded into history. You've journeyed through the dazzling heights of Byzantine purple, marveling at its power, its cost, its almost mythical status. But like all grand empires and their most treasured secrets, even the vibrant reign of Tyrian purple had to face its twilight. You see, nothing, not even a color so deeply intertwined with divine right, is truly immortal. You might imagine the decline of such a monumental secret to be a sudden, dramatic collapse, like a forgotten pot of murex stew left out too long. But no, it was far more insidious, a slow, creeping decay, like the gradual fading of an ancient tapestry left too long in the sun. As you stand on the precipice of the empire's final centuries, you observe the signs of strain. The Byzantine Empire, once a sprawling colossus, was shrinking. Constant warfare, economic woes, and internal strife were gnawing at its foundations. Maintaining those sprawling, incredibly smelly murex farms and the complex, labor-intensive dye workshops wasn't cheap. Imagine trying to run a high-end, artisanal perfume factory today, but your main ingredient is a rare, stinky sea snail, and your supply chain is constantly under attack by pirates or rival states. It becomes unsustainable, to say the least. The empire's territorial losses were a massive blow. Those precious coastlines where the murex snails thrived, particularly in the Aegean and along the Levantine coast, slowly slipped from Byzantine control. Without direct access to the raw materials, the very lifeblood of the purple industry began to thin. It's like owning the world's most exclusive diamond mine, only to have it gradually annexed by your neighbors. You might have the knowledge, but if you don't have the rocks, well, you're just a very knowledgeable but ultimately rockless diamond merchant. Then came the economic crunch. The Byzantine currency, once the stable gold nomisma, began to debase. Inflation soared. When your empire is struggling to feed its people and defend its borders, investing vast sums in snail slime for imperial robes starts to look less like a divine necessity and more like an extravagant, perhaps even irresponsible luxury. The focus shifted from the sublime to the survival. You can almost hear the imperial accountants sighing, "Do we really need another purple tunic, Your Majesty? We're a bit short on spears this quarter." But it wasn't just internal pressures. The geopolitical landscape was shifting dramatically. The rise of powerful maritime republics like Venice and Genoa, with their burgeoning trade networks, began to bypass the traditional Byzantine routes. These shrewd merchants weren't interested in maintaining the Byzantine state monopoly. They were interested in profit. They sought out cheaper, faster alternatives for purple dyes, even if they lacked the true Tyrian vibrancy. They found purples derived from lichens, from insects like the cochineal, which, while not the real deal, offered a passable imitation at a fraction of the cost and without the truly eye-watering smell. Why spend a king's ransom on a single robe when you could outfit an entire court in a decent, if slightly less regal, shade for the same price? It was a bit like choosing a perfectly good, mass-produced latte over a hand-ground, single-origin, artisanal brew that costs 10 times as much and requires you to milk the cow yourself. The most catastrophic blow, however, came in 1204 with the Fourth Crusade. Imagine the shock, the devastation as Western Crusaders, ostensibly on their way to the Holy Land, instead sacked and plundered the very heart of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople itself. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was an existential cataclysm. The city was ravaged, treasures looted, and the intricate social and economic fabric of the empire was torn asunder. During this period of chaos, many of the skilled artisans, the master dyers who held the secrets of Tyrian Purple in their very hands, were dispersed, enslaved, or simply perished. Their workshops, once humming with the foul odor of ambition, lay in ruins or were abandoned. The knowledge, often passed down orally from master to apprentice generation after generation, was fractured. It was as if the world's most guarded family recipe was suddenly scattered to the winds, with no one left to remember the exact measurements or the secret ingredient. Probably because nobody wanted to be the one to write down, "Add 300 pounds of rotting sea snails." Historians still argue whether any true knowledge of the precise murex species and processing techniques truly survived the fall of Constantinople in 1204, or if it was already a dying art by then, clinging on by a thread. Some scholars suggest that a few isolated pockets of production might have lingered in the shattered remnants of the empire, perhaps on a remote island or in a distant province, quietly producing small quantities for a few decades more. But even if it did, it was a ghost of its former self, a faint echo of the imperial glory. The true final curtain call for Byzantine Purple came with the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. This wasn't just the end of an empire. It was the end of an era. The last vestiges of the imperial court, the last workshops that might have clung to the ancient methods, were swept away. The new Ottoman rulers had their own traditions, their own colors, their own priorities. They weren't interested in reviving a costly, labor-intensive, and frankly pungent imperial monopoly from a conquered people. The once sacred purple dye houses, if any still existed, were likely repurposed, left to decay, or simply forgotten. The last master dyers, if they survived the siege, would have carried their ancient secrets to their graves, their specialized knowledge becoming just another casualty of the relentless march of history. You can almost picture them, whispering the final steps of the process to the cold earth, ensuring no one else would ever have to endure that smell again. So, the secrets of Tyrian Purple, once guarded with imperial ferocity, simply faded away. They weren't deliberately destroyed in a dramatic explosion of knowledge, but rather withered from neglect, economic pressure, and the brutal realities of war. The specific species of murex used, the exact fermentation times, the precise sequence of vats and exposures to light, all became footnotes in forgotten ledgers or simply lost memories. The world moved on, finding new, less demanding ways to achieve a royal hue, even if it never quite matched the sublime, almost glowing intensity of the true imperial purple. The scent of the murex, once a sign of power, became nothing more than a memory, lost to the salt spray and the turning tides of time. So, you've reclined, perhaps nestled deeper into your pillow, as we've explored the very tangible, very smelly reality of Byzantine purple. You've journeyed from humble sea snails to imperial decree, seen it on emperors, and even imagined the tiny chamber where princes were born into its hallowed presence. But now, as the last faint whisper of the murex dye works fades into the annals of history, a demise we touched upon, a slow, almost imperceptible slipping away of a profoundly guarded secret, you might wonder. Did the magic just disappear? Did the world simply shrug and move on to the next fashionable hue? Oh, my dear friend, if only history were so tidy and uncomplicated. No, the true Tyrian purple, the original, the one that smelled faintly of the sea and rather strongly of ancient fish markets, may have vanished, its precise recipe becoming a ghost in the archives. But the idea of it, the myth of it, that my sleepy scholar proved far more resilient than any snail shell. It was as if the color itself had embedded itself into the very fabric of human aspiration, refusing to be relegated to a forgotten footnote. Imagine for a moment, if you will, a world where the most coveted luxury brand suddenly ceases production. No more limited edition handbags, no more bespoke suits. You'd think the demand would simply evaporate, right? But what often happens is the opposite. The legend grows. The scarcity elevates its status even further in the collective memory, transforming a tangible object into an almost mythical artifact. And so it was with Byzantine purple. Even as the last true batches were produced, perhaps in hushed, dwindling quantities, the very concept of porphyra, the imperial purple, continued to resonate with an almost spiritual power. You see, the Byzantines weren't just dyeing fabric, they were dyeing an entire worldview. They imbued that color with divinity, with unquestionable authority, with a lineage stretching back to ancient Rome and, in their minds, even further to the very heavens. When the dye production finally ceased, possibly around the fall of Constantinople in 1453, or perhaps even earlier due to economic decline and the sheer logistical nightmare of maintaining such an industrial secret, the world didn't suddenly forget what imperial purple meant. Far from it. Instead, the color transitioned from a physical reality to a potent symbol in the Western imagination. European monarchs, eager to inherit the mantle of Rome and Byzantium, might not have had access to the genuine article, but they certainly understood its meaning. They sought out the closest available purples, often derived from madder root or later, cochineal, to adorn their robes, their banners, their very personages. They were, in essence, trying to wear the idea of Byzantine power, even if the shade was a little off, like trying to recreate a Michelin-starred dish with supermarket ingredients. Close enough for government work. You can almost hear a medieval tailor grumbling as he tried to match some faded tapestry. The phrase, born in the purple, or porphyrogenitos, became a particularly enduring piece of this myth. Even centuries after the purple chamber itself might have been little more than a dusty memory, the concept of a ruler whose legitimacy was derived from birthright, from being literally born into royalty, persisted. It became a shorthand for unquestionable, inherited power. You'd find this idea echoed in the grand narratives of European dynasties, where the notion of divine right was meticulously crafted, often drawing, whether consciously or unconsciously, from the Byzantine playbook. It was a convenient way to say, "Don't question me, I was born for this." Without having to get into the messy details of actual succession struggles or, heaven forbid, popular opinion, consider the literature and art that followed the Byzantine era. Descriptions of emperors and kings often invoked the color purple as a signifier of their majesty, even if the artists themselves had never seen the true Tyrian hue. Chronicles and historical accounts would speak of the imperial purple as a given, a foundational element of royal power, almost as if the very air around a monarch shimmered with it. It became a literary trope, a shorthand for ultimate authority. You could say it was the original power suit, only far more elaborate and probably less comfortable for a long day of ruling. One fascinating mainstream historical fact that underscores this enduring myth is how the Catholic Church, particularly its highest echelons, continued to use purple as a symbol of authority and spiritual sovereignty. While the papal purple and cardinalatial purple were never the true Tyrian dye, often derived from less costly and more accessible sources, their adoption was a clear inheritance of the Roman and Byzantine tradition. It wasn't just about looking fancy. It was about laying claim to a visual language of power that had been refined over a millennium. When you see a cardinal in his deep purple vestments, you are, in a way, witnessing a distant echo of a Byzantine emperor, bridging millennia with a single color. And for a quirky tidbit, did you know that even after the true Tyrian purple was lost, there were sporadic, often unsuccessful, attempts over the centuries to rediscover its exact production method? People were so captivated by its legend and its unique properties, its non-fading quality, its particular shade, that they would try to reverse engineer it from ancient texts or even archaeological finds. Imagine medieval alchemists, not just seeking gold, but diligently collecting snail shells, hoping to unlock the secrets of the ancients. It's like trying to find the recipe for Coca-Cola by sniffing old bottles. Admirable dedication, if a little misguided without the right chemical knowledge. Historians still argue whether the final cessation of Tyrian purple production was a sudden event or a gradual decline. Was it the Ottoman conquest that severed the last remaining supply lines and intellectual capital, or had the industry already withered away due to economic pressures and the sheer difficulty of its process? Some scholars lean towards a slow, agonizing fade, like a magnificent sunset, while others suggest a more abrupt collapse, like a sudden power outage. Regardless of the exact moment it breathed its last, the memory of its vibrancy, its exclusivity, and its divine association certainly did not fade with it. The myth of purple wasn't just about color. It was about an entire system of belief. It represented the unshakable order of the Byzantine Empire, its claim to be the direct heir of Rome, and its unique blend of political and religious authority. When you thought of Byzantium, you thought of gold and mosaics, yes, but you also thought of purple, the color that defined its emperors, its court, and its very identity. It was a brand, an identity, a legacy, all rolled into one magnificent, perhaps slightly stinky hue. Even in our modern world, the echoes persist. We still associate purple with royalty, with luxury, with something a cut above the ordinary. Think of the purple patch in sports, signifying a period of exceptional performance, or the Purple Heart, awarded for bravery in battle. These are not direct descendants of Tyrian purple, but they tap into a deeply ingrained cultural understanding of purple as a color of distinction, of rarity, of something truly special. It's like a secret handshake between millennia, a nod to an ancient tradition that still resonates in our subconscious. So, as you drift off, consider the enduring power of a single color. It transcended its physical form, becoming an idea, a legend, a whisper of imperial grandeur that continues to echo through the corridors of history. The Byzantines may have lost their precious dye, but they ensured that its symbolic reign would last forever. And that, my friend, is a legacy more vibrant than any pigment. You've heard the whispers, haven't you? The tantalizing notion of a secret lost to the ages. A color so profound it seemed to evaporate from human knowledge, leaving only its legend behind. For centuries, the true Tyrian purple, the very essence of Byzantine imperial power, became an enigma, a historical ghost. But thankfully, the relentless curiosity of modern science, armed with its incredible tools and an almost obsessive need to pull back the curtain on ancient mysteries, simply couldn't let that stand. So you settle in because we're about to peek behind that curtain with the help of some very clever chemists and their molecular magnifying glasses. Imagine, for a moment, being a scientist in the late 19th or early 20th century, gazing at a tiny, faded fragment of ancient cloth, perhaps a scrap recovered from an archaeological dig, or a thread barely clinging to a tattered manuscript. It's a whisper of purple barely there, yet you know deep in your scientific soul that this isn't just any purple. This is the purple. How do you even begin to unravel its chemical identity when the last person who truly understood its creation lived 1,000 years ago? You don't have a recipe book, no ancient lab notes, just a few atoms clinging together in a very specific, stubbornly resilient way. Well, you begin by being incredibly patient, incredibly precise, and possessing a truly formidable understanding of organic chemistry. You see, the process of identifying this lost dye was less like finding a treasure map and more like forensic science for textiles. Scientists would carefully extract the tiniest possible samples, often just a few micrograms. That's a millionth of a gram, mind you, from these precious ancient artifacts. They couldn't just dissolve the whole thing, could they? That would be historical sacrilege. Instead, they employed sophisticated analytical techniques, the kind that can tell you the exact atomic composition of a molecule without destroying the sample entirely. Think of techniques like chromatography, which separates compounds, or spectroscopy, which reads the fingerprint of a molecule based on how it interacts with light. It's like listening to a tiny, molecular whisper and understanding its entire life story. And after years of painstaking work, countless experiments, and perhaps a few late-night cups of coffee that could rival the strength of a Byzantine emperor's will, the secret was finally unveiled. The year was 1909, and a German chemist named Paul Friedlander, working with just 12,000 murex snails, a truly impressive number, though perhaps not ideal for the snails, managed to extract and analyze enough of the precious substance to definitively identify its chemical structure. This was a mainstream historical fact that sent ripples of excitement through the scientific community. The grand reveal? The molecule responsible for Tyrian Purple's legendary hue was identified as 6,6-dibromoindigo. Say that slowly. Dibromoindigo. It sounds quite elegant, doesn't it? A bit like a secret password from a very exclusive club. Now, you might be thinking, indigo? Isn't that blue? And you'd be right. Indigo, the base molecule, is indeed responsible for the classic deep blue of denim jeans. But here's where the magic and the bromine come into play. The dibromo part of 6,6-dibromoindigo refers to the two bromine atoms that are uniquely attached to the indigo molecule. These bromine atoms, relatively heavy and somewhat unusual guests in an organic dye molecule, are the true superstars of this chemical drama. They shift the entire light-absorbing properties of the indigo, pushing its color spectrum from blue into that glorious, regal purple. It's like adding just the right amount of a secret ingredient to a familiar recipe, transforming it into something utterly unique and far more luxurious. So, why was this specific molecule, 6,6-dibromoindigo, so incredibly special? Why did it command such exorbitant prices and become the exclusive preserve of emperors? Well, beyond its sheer rarity and the nightmarish process of extracting it from those tiny snail glands, a truly quirky tidbit. Each snail only yields a minuscule drop of precursor liquid, often less than the head of a pin. Its chemical properties were simply unparalleled for its time. First, there was its legendary color fastness. You know how some modern dyes can fade in the sun, or bleed in the wash, turning your once vibrant shirt into a sad, washed-out shadow of its former self? Not Tyrian Purple. Those bromine atoms, you see, make the molecule incredibly stable. It was remarkably resistant to light, washing, and even acids. Imagine a fabric that could withstand centuries of exposure, retaining its deep, rich hue with minimal degradation. This wasn't just a dye. It was an investment in permanence, a visual declaration that what was dyed purple was meant to last, just like the empire itself. It was the original fade-resistant fabric, long before anyone dreamed of synthetic polymers. Then there was its unique optical quality. The color wasn't just a flat purple. It possessed a remarkable depth and luminosity that seemed to shift depending on the light. In bright sunlight, it might appear a brilliant, almost shocking reddish purple, while in the subdued light of an imperial chamber or a church, it could deepen to a rich, velvety violet, almost black in its intensity. This chameleon-like quality gave it an almost living presence, a shimmer that no other dye could replicate. It wasn't static, it danced. And this, my friend, is something your high-definition screen, as impressive as it is, simply cannot convey. You really had to see it, feel it, practically breathe it to understand its power. Chemists are still exploring the exact nuances of how those bromine atoms interact with light to create such a profound and variable color, particularly its metallic sheen. Some scholarly debate still exists regarding whether slight variations in the murex species used, or the precise conditions of the dyeing process, might have led to subtle chemical differences in the final product, resulting in a spectrum of purples rather than a single monolithic shade. Was the emperor's purple truly identical to the purple of a high-ranking official? Or were there subtle, chemically distinct variations only a true connoisseur could discern? We might never know for sure, but the molecular blueprint remains the same. The identification of 6,6-dibromoindigo also helped modern scientists understand why the ancient production process was so incredibly complex and, frankly, so incredibly smelly. The precursor substance extracted from the snails isn't purple at all. It's a colorless liquid. It only turns purple through a process involving air exposure, sunlight, and a precise chemical reaction known as oxidation. This is why it's called a vat dye. The fabric is submerged in a liquid solution, then pulled out to react with the air and bloom into color. It's like a magic trick, but with far more stench and far fewer rabbits. You can almost hear the ancient dyers muttering, "Right? Just a little more sun, a little more eau de snail, and voila, imperial glory." So, you see, while the secrets of the ancient artisans were lost to the ages, the enduring legacy of their work, etched into the very molecules of surviving textiles, allowed modern science to reverse engineer the mystery. We can now synthesize 6,6-dibromoindigo in a lab, though it's still not a cheap or easy process. But even with all our modern chemical prowess, replicating the exact quality and feel of the ancient dye, with all its subtle impurities and the unique way it interacted with natural fibers, remains a challenge. It's a reminder that sometimes the imperfections of ancient craft actually contributed to its unique beauty. And as you drift off, you can appreciate the quiet marvel of it all. That a tiny, unassuming sea snail held within its minuscule body the chemical key to an empire's prestige. That centuries later, dedicated scientists, armed with nothing but their intellect and incredibly precise equipment, could unlock that secret. The Byzantines loved their purple dye so much because it was more than just a color. It was a statement. And thanks to modern chemistry, we now understand on a molecular level precisely why that statement was so incredibly powerful and enduring. It wasn't just color. It was chemistry, power, and history, all wrapped up in a single magnificent hue. You've journeyed through the murky depths of murex snails, navigated the fragrant, or, let's be honest, probably not so fragrant workshops of ancient dyers, and stood in awe of emperors draped in the most coveted color known to humanity. Now, as the final chapter of our Purple Odyssey unfolds, you find yourself contemplating something truly profound. How a single hue, a specific shade of violet red, came to embody the very soul of an empire that defied time itself. Imagine, if you will, looking at a color not just as a pigment, but as a living, breathing testament to power, an echo of divine right, and a whisper of secrets held for 1,000 years. That, my friend, is the enduring legacy of Byzantine purple. It wasn't merely a fashion statement. It was the empire's beating heart, its visual manifesto, its very DNA woven into fabric. Think about it. For over a millennium, the Byzantine Empire, the true inheritor of Rome's imperial mantle, stood as a beacon of civilization, art, and complex governance. And through all those centuries, from the glittering mosaics of Hagia Sophia to the solemn pronouncements of its emperors, one color reigned supreme. It was omnipresent yet utterly exclusive. It was a paradox wrapped in a mystery, dyed in an enigma. You might even say it was the original influencer color, long before hashtags and sponsored posts, setting trends for an entire civilization. The mystique of Byzantine purple wasn't just about its exorbitant cost or the gnarly process of its creation, though those certainly added to its allure. No, it was the idea of it. You see, this wasn't just any purple. This was Tyrian purple, the royal purple, the Imperial purple. It carried with it the weight of history, the whispers of Phoenician traders, Roman emperors, and now the Byzantine basileus. It was a color so potent, so deeply intertwined with authority, that even its shadow seemed to carry gravitas. Imagine trying to replicate that kind of brand loyalty today. Good luck getting people to pay a king's ransom for a shade of mauve simply because it came from a very particular, stinky snail. Yet, for the Byzantines, it was worth every single stinky, slimy penny. This mystique was carefully cultivated. The state didn't just control production, it controlled the narrative. You couldn't just buy imperial purple. It had to be bestowed. It was a gift from the emperor, a sign of supreme favor, a diplomatic tool more potent than 1,000 treaties. When a foreign dignitary was presented with a purple robe, they weren't just getting fancy clothes. They were receiving a tangible piece of the empire's power, a visual declaration that they were now, in some small way, connected to the sun on earth. It was the ultimate "you've been accepted into our exclusive club" gesture. Far more impressive than a velvet rope and a bouncer named Boris. And speaking of power, the purple dye was the ultimate visual shorthand for imperial authority. The emperor, born in the sacred porphyra, literally born in the purple, was a walking, breathing embodiment of this color. His robes, his footwear, even the ink used to sign imperial decrees, all proclaimed his unique, divinely sanctioned rule. This wasn't just about looking good for the imperial portraits. It was about projecting an image of unshakable, God-given power that resonated through every corner of the empire. You didn't just obey the emperor, you obeyed the very idea of the emperor, an idea steeped in purple. This visual language was so strong that even a blind person, unable to see the color, would have understood its significance through the reverence and awe it inspired in others. This unwavering association with power helped cement the Byzantine Empire's remarkable longevity. While empires rose and fell around it, Byzantium, with its purple-clad emperors, endured for over 1,000 years. A mainstream historical fact that underscores its incredible resilience and the strength of its symbolic foundations. The purple wasn't just an accessory. It was a cornerstone of its stability, a constant reminder of the imperial legacy stretching back to ancient Rome. But the purple's reign wasn't just about the emperor. It permeated the entire fabric of Byzantine society, reaching into the most sacred spaces. Think of the church, an institution deeply intertwined with the state. Priests and patriarchs wore purple vestments, not necessarily the imperial shade, but colors derived from the same precious murex, symbolizing their spiritual authority and connection to the divine. This pervasive use cemented purple as a color of both earthly and heavenly power. It was a visual bridge between the sacred and the secular, a color that quite literally wrapped itself around the empire's soul. Even in art, the purple reigned supreme. You see it in the shimmering mosaics of Ravenna, depicting emperors and empresses in glorious purple robes, their forms almost glowing with the imperial hue. You find it in illuminated manuscripts, where the most important texts were written on purple-dyed parchment, the words inscribed in gold or silver, creating an effect of otherworldly grandeur. This wasn't just aesthetic choice. It was a deliberate act of reinforcing the empire's values, its piety, and its unassailable authority through visual storytelling. It's like their version of putting a gold frame around a particularly important tweet. Now, you might wonder, with all this talk of secrecy and state control, did anyone ever try to fake it? Oh, absolutely. There's a quirky tidbit about cheaper, vegetable-based dyes being passed off as the real deal, particularly as the true Tyrian purple became even rarer and more expensive. Imagine the medieval equivalent of someone trying to sell you a designer handbag from a back alley, only instead of pleather, it's a fabric dyed with lichen. The Byzantines, with their keen eye for quality and their strict sumptuary laws, were generally not fooled, and the penalties for such deception were, shall we say, discouraging. You wouldn't want to be caught trying to pass off a beet juice purple as the real deal. It would be a very bad day for your career, and possibly your limbs. As centuries turned into millennia, the secrets of true Tyrian purple production began to fade. The exact methods, the specific locations of the snail beds, the intricate chemical processes, all became increasingly obscure, victims of wars, economic shifts, and the simple passage of time. Historians still debate whether the knowledge was truly lost or simply became uneconomical and dangerous to pursue, eventually dying out with the last specialized dyers. But regardless of the exact cause, the color that had defined an empire slowly retreated from the world of the living, becoming a legend. Yet, even in its absence, the myth of Byzantine purple endured. It became a powerful symbol in subsequent eras, invoked whenever someone wished to convey ultimate power, wealth, or a connection to ancient imperial glory. It lived on in literature, in the collective memory of what Byzantium represented. It became the phantom limb of a fallen empire, still felt, still remembered, still revered. And then, as if by magic, modern science stepped in. Through the wonders of contemporary chemistry, you can now peer into the molecular structure of ancient dye samples, unraveling the secrets that were guarded for centuries. Scientists have identified the unique bromine compounds that gave Tyrian purple its incredible light fastness and its distinctive, almost metallic sheen. They've discovered why it didn't fade, why it deepened with age, and why it was so utterly unique. It's like finally getting the secret recipe to your grandmother's legendary cookies, only instead of flour and sugar, it's dibromoindigo and ancient sea snail guts. So, as you drift towards the end of our story, reflect on this singular color. Byzantine purple isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a profound metaphor for the empire itself. It was complex, difficult to acquire, incredibly valuable, and utterly unique. It represented divine sanction, political power, economic might, and an enduring cultural identity. Like the empire, it was resilient, vibrant, and steeped in tradition. It was a color that didn't just exist in the Byzantine Empire. It was, in many ways, the very essence of the Byzantine Empire. It was their brand, their legacy, their eternal reign, all distilled into a single, magnificent, and unforgettable shade. And now, as the last vestiges of Byzantine purple shimmer in your mind's eye, fading gently into the twilight, you can feel the weight of history settle softly around you. The echoes of emperors, the whispers of ancient ceremonies, the slow, rhythmic churn of the sea as the murex snails gave up their precious secret. It all blends into a calming lullaby. The vibrant hue, once so central to an empire's identity, now transforms into a gentle warmth, a comforting presence as you prepare to rest. Let the images of those regal robes, those glittering mosaics, those ancient manuscripts, become soft, indistinct shapes. The sharp details of power and mystique soften into a hazy glow, a beautiful memory of a world long past. The deep, rich purple that once commanded awe now simply invites tranquility. You've explored the depths of its meaning, understood its profound impact, and now that understanding can simply be. There's nothing more to grasp, nothing more to analyze. Just the gentle fading of a magnificent color, a quiet testament to a fascinating past. Feel the calm settle over you, a peaceful, enveloping quiet. The journey through history is complete for tonight. The imperial purple, once a symbol of unyielding might, now becomes a soft, comforting blanket of dreams. Let your mind drift, untethered, as the last traces of the Byzantines' beloved color melt into the darkness.